The man history remembers as Amon Göth was born Amon Leopold Göth on December 11, 1908, in Vienna, the capital of what was then the vast Austro-Hungarian Empire. His arrival came at a time when the empire was still among Europe's great powers, a sprawling, multi-ethnic realm stretching from the Alps to the Balkans. Vienna was at the heart of it, cultured, prosperous and modern, and young Amon entered a household that reflected that affluence. His father, Amon Franz Göth, owned a well-established Viennese publishing house, a business that specialized primarily in military literature, but also printed religious works and postcards. The company performed well enough that the family enjoyed the privileges of the upper middle class. Amon's mother, Berta Göth, came from a similarly respectable background. Their only child, Amon grew up surrounded by material comfort and the expectations that he would one day take his place in the family business. Educated first at a Catholic middle-class school in Vienna, Amon later attended an agricultural college near the modern Czech border. His teachers described him as intelligent, restless, and occasionally defiant, qualities that hinted at both promise and volatility. Though his parents' prosperity gave him opportunities rare for the time, his home life was not a warm one. His father traveled extensively for business, often abroad for weeks or months at a time, while his mother managed the publishing office in his absence. With both parents largely preoccupied, young Amon was raised mainly by an aunt. This arrangement left emotional scars that would later be recalled by those who knew him. Isolated, indulged, and without meaningful parental guidance, Göth grew increasingly resentful of authority. In later years, his Polish mistress Ruth Irene Kalman, known as Ruth Irene Calder, told an interviewer that Göth often spoke bitterly about feeling neglected as a child, a grievance that, in her words, never left him. Göth's adolescence unfolded against a backdrop of global upheaval. When he was barely 6 years old, Europe descended into the First World War. Austria-Hungary and Germany aligned against Britain, France, and Russia, in a conflict that would eventually engulf much of the world. Vienna, though distant from the front lines, bore the economic strain and emotional toll of a protracted war. Food shortages, casualty reports, and political tension filled Amon's formative years. When the fighting ended in 1918, the Austro-Hungarian Empire collapsed, leaving behind a much smaller, poorer Republic of Austria. Overnight, Vienna was transformed from the capital of a mighty empire into the seat of a struggling, landlocked state. The disintegration of old hierarchies produced both anxiety and anger across Austrian society. For young men like Göth, raised amid privilege and order, the post-war years were marked by uncertainty and humiliation. During his late teens, Göth's relationship with his family deteriorated. His parents expected him to study diligently and prepare to inherit the publishing firm. Instead, he grew disinterested in business and academics alike. He left the agricultural college after only a few months and returned to Vienna without a clear direction. Athletic and headstrong, he gravitated toward political activism, specifically the far-right movements gaining popularity among disillusioned Austrians. In 1925, at the age of 17, Göth joined the Austrian branch of the National Socialist German Workers' Party, commonly known as the Nazi Party. At the time, the party remained a marginal movement, tainted by the failure of Adolf Hitler's 1923 Munich Putsch. Yet for many Austrians frustrated by national decline, Nazism's blend of ultranationalism, racial ideology, and anti-Semitism held a dangerous appeal. Several motives likely drew Göth in. Like many of his generation, he viewed the Treaty of Versailles, which dismantled Germany's military and imposed harsh reparations, as unjust. The Nazi message of reclaiming strength, unity, and national pride resonated deeply in neighboring Austria, itself humiliated by territorial losses and economic hardship. Göth was also attracted to the movement's emphasis on discipline and physical vigor. For a young man who had grown up without strong paternal direction, the paramilitary structure of Nazi organizations offered both belonging and purpose. At first, his involvement appeared ideological, but not yet violent. That would change by the late 1920s. As political tension in Austria escalated, Göth's activities became more extreme. In 1927, while working briefly in his father's publishing house, he joined the Styrischer Heimatschutz, or Styrian Home Guard, a right-wing militia notorious for its fierce anti-Semitism and hostility towards socialism. It was here that Göth's racial hatred, already encouraged by Nazi propaganda, hardened into conviction. By 1930, Göth formally entered the Austrian Nazi Party as a full member, receiving party number 510-764, and soon after, joined the SS, the elite paramilitary organization that would later become the main instrument of Nazi terror. His SS membership, recorded as number 43,673, placed him among the early recruits, men who would later be celebrated within the regime as old fighters. In the early 1930s, Austria was a nation divided between conservative monarchists, democratic socialists, and a growing fascist right. When Hitler seized power in Germany in 1933, Austria's government, fearful of Nazi infiltration, banned the Austrian branch of the party. Göth, who had already been participating in illegal propaganda and sabotage, became a wanted man. On June 19, 1933, he fled across the border into Germany, joining hundreds of Austrian Nazis who had established an exile network in Bavaria. There, he continued his activities under the protection of the German SS, working as a courier and radio operator smuggling propaganda into Austria. Later that year, Austrian authorities arrested him on charges of terrorism, but for lack of evidence, he was released. Within months, he had crossed back into Germany once again. It was during this period that Göth's reputation within the Austrian Nazi exile community began to grow. He proved efficient, loyal, and unflinching, qualities valued by his superiors. In 1934, he was implicated in the plot that culminated in the assassination of Austrian Chancellor Engelbert Dollfuss, an act intended to pave the way for a Nazi takeover of Austria. Although Göth's exact role remains uncertain, he was reportedly involved in the planning. Following the failed coup, he again evaded capture and fled to Germany. By the time he turned 26, Göth had become a fully committed Nazi operative, shifting effortlessly between propaganda work, clandestine missions, and paramilitary duties. His early life, marked by privilege, resentment, and ideological seduction, had prepared him to embrace a worldview defined by obedience, violence, and racial hatred. As the 1930s advanced, Austria remained politically unstable, its independence hanging by a thread. In exile, Göth dedicated himself to strengthening his position within the SS. The organization was expanding rapidly under Heinrich Himmler, transforming from Hitler's personal bodyguard into a massive, ideologically driven apparatus of surveillance and enforcement. For men like Göth, ambitious and ruthless, the SS offered not only status, but also a sense of destiny. The stage was now set. Within a decade, Amon Göth would rise from a restless Austrian youth to a key instrument of one of history's darkest enterprises. After escaping Austria in 1934, Amon Göth settled once again in Bavaria, where numerous Austrian exiles gathered under the patronage of the German Nazi Party. For the first time in his life, he was part of a state that reflected the ideology he had long served in secret. Germany under Adolf Hitler had become a single-party dictatorship. Its propaganda, its militarism, and its rigid hierarchy provided the model that men like Göth admired and sought to replicate back home. Göth immersed himself in the expanding SS network, which was then undergoing a dramatic transformation. Under Heinrich Himmler's leadership, the SS was evolving from an elite guard unit into a vast institution, combining intelligence, policing, and ideological indoctrination. Its members were taught that loyalty to Hitler outweighed any moral or legal restraint. For Göth, who already viewed discipline and obedience as virtues, this philosophy fit perfectly. In the mid-1930s, Göth obtained a position at Dachau, the first concentration camp established by the Nazi regime. Although his stay there was brief, it exposed him to the administrative mechanisms of repression, registration, forced labor, punishment, and execution. Dachau, originally designed for political prisoners, became the prototype for the concentration camp system that would soon spread across Europe. Göth's service there introduced him to the bureaucratic normality of cruelty, a pattern that would define his later career. By 1935, however, Göth's trajectory momentarily faltered. He quarreled with a superior officer, Alfred Bigler, and left the SS for a period, retreating into the family publishing business in Germany. That same year, Austria's Nazi movement had been decisively crushed, and many of its operatives, including Göth, faced dwindling prospects. Yet this lull did not last. In 1937, Göth petitioned to have his Austrian Nazi membership officially transferred to the German party registry in Munich. The request was granted, marking his formal reintegration into the German SS. The timing was no coincidence. Hitler's regime was by then pressing relentlessly for Anschluss, the annexation of Austria, into the Third Reich. Göth saw in this campaign not only a national cause but a personal vindication. When German troops crossed the Austrian border in March 1938, Göth returned to Vienna as both a conqueror and a true believer. He was 29 years old. The SS, now empowered to reshape Austria, moved quickly to enforce Nazi racial policy. Jewish businesses were seized, professionals dismissed, and tens of thousands of people driven from their homes. Göth, assigned to SS Standarte 89, took part in implementing these measures. That same year, he married Annie Geiger, a young Austrian woman he met at a motorcycling event. The SS had by then introduced strict marriage requirements. Prospective couples were vetted for racial purity and political reliability. Göth and Geiger passed these tests and were wed on October 23, 1938. Over the following years, they had 3 children, though only 2 survived infancy. The marriage, however, would prove largely nominal. Göth's personal ambitions now lay entirely within the SS hierarchy. The late 1930s were a period of rapid militarization and ideological hardening across Germany. The annexation of Austria was followed by the dismemberment of Czechoslovakia and then the invasion of Poland in September 1939, the act that ignited the Second World War. At the outbreak of hostilities, Göth was transferred to an SS combat formation, SS Standarte 3rd, and soon after promoted to an administrative rank known as Verwaltungsführer, or administrative officer. He served in Upper Silesia, near the industrial city of Katowice, an area newly annexed from Poland. His role combined logistics, finance, and the supervision of forced labor projects. By 1940 and 1941, the machinery of Nazi occupation in Poland was accelerating. The general government, administered from Kraków, became a laboratory for racial policy, expulsion, ghettoization, and slave labor. Göth's office handled records, requisitions, and budgets connected to these programs. Official reports praised his efficiency and ideological reliability. He had become exactly the kind of mid-level functionary the regime depended on, loyal, practical, and untroubled by moral questions. His work brought him into contact with one of the most powerful figures in occupied Poland, Odilo Globoknik, the SS and police leader based in Lublin. Globoknik, also Austrian, was overseeing the early stages of Operation Reinhard, the plan to exterminate Poland's Jewish population through newly built death camps at Białystok, Sobibor, and Treblinka. Göth was transferred to Lublin in mid-1942 to assist in administrative coordination, a move that would shape his fate. Under Globoknik, Göth learned the methods that governed the Holocaust's bureaucracy, deportation lists, transport timetables, seizure of property, and exploitation of labor before extermination. Witnesses later recalled his eagerness to absorb procedure, his fascination with the logistical side of killing. He watched as tens of thousands of Jews were forced onto trains bound for the gas chambers, their belongings catalogued and sold for profit. At Lublin, Göth also witnessed the blending of ideology and corruption that characterized many SS operations. Globoknik and his staff amassed personal fortunes through the confiscation of valuables and black market trading. Göth followed the pattern, learning that cruelty could serve both ideological and personal ends. By the end of 1942, his superiors regarded him as an officer capable of greater responsibility. On February 11, 1943, Göth received orders appointing him commandant of a new concentration camp near Kraków, to be constructed on the site of an existing forced labor facility. It would be called Kraków-Płaszów. This promotion marked the culmination of his steady rise through the ranks. Over less than a decade, Amon Göth had transformed from a disaffected Viennese youth into a key functionary of the SS, a man entrusted with commanding thousands of prisoners and directing one of the most infamous camps in Nazi-occupied Poland. At Płaszów, his name would become synonymous with arbitrary murder and terror. The instincts he had honed, obedience, efficiency, and contempt for human life, would now be unleashed on an unimaginable scale. When Amon Göth arrived in Kraków in February 1943, he came with a reputation for efficiency and ruthlessness. His assignment was to transform a small forced labor site at Płaszów, on the southern edge of the city, into a full-scale concentration camp. The new facility was to serve two purposes: to supply slave labor for the German war economy, and to hold the Jews of Kraków after the liquidation of the city's ghetto. The site chosen for the camp covered roughly 200 acres, land that included 2 Jewish cemeteries. Construction began at once, carried out by Jewish prisoners themselves. Barracks, watchtowers, barbed wire fencing, and administrative buildings rose in a matter of weeks. On the 13th of March 1943, Göth oversaw the final liquidation of the Kraków ghetto. Thousands of Jews were marched under guard to Płaszów. The elderly and infirm were shot on the spot, and others were sent directly to the Auschwitz-Birkenau death camp. From the outset, Göth established his rule through terror. At the first assembly of prisoners he announced, "I am your God here." To those who survived, it was not an exaggeration. He exercised absolute power over life and death within the camp's fences. His daily presence, mounted on horseback or accompanied by his dogs, Rolf and Ralph, became synonymous with fear. Prisoners learned that even minor infractions could bring instant execution. The population of Płaszów grew rapidly. By the spring of 1944, more than 25,000 people were held there, Jews from Kraków and neighboring towns, Poles arrested for forced labor, and later Hungarian and Slovak deportees. Officially, Płaszów was a labor camp, not a death camp. It had no gas chambers, and its stated purpose was to provide industrial output for the German army. Yet mortality was enormous. Prisoners were worked to exhaustion on starvation rations, epidemics of typhus and dysentery spread unchecked, and beatings and shootings were routine. Eyewitnesses later described Göth's arbitrary violence. He was known to fire his rifle from the balcony of his villa into groups of workers below. At morning roll calls, he might select several people at random to be hanged as an example. When one labor detail failed to meet its quota, he ordered every fifth man in the group shot. These acts were not part of formal punishment procedures. They were demonstrations of dominance, carried out for effect. Under his command, executions were conducted at Hujowa Górka, a hill within the camp perimeter that became a mass grave site. Estimates vary, but between 8,000 and 12,000 people were murdered there in less than 2 years. Göth personally supervised many of the shootings. His subordinates followed his lead, ensuring that violence remained the governing principle of camp discipline. While Göth enforced ideological cruelty, he also exploited his position for personal gain. As transports of Jews arrived from across southern Poland, their possessions, jewelry, currency, clothing were confiscated and stored. Large portions of these valuables disappeared into private hands. Göth shipped crates of gold, furs, and silverware to Vienna, sending them to his wife and to the offices of his parents' publishing firm. Corruption, in the SS environment, was both common and dangerous. It demonstrated how profit and ideology could coexist within the machinery of genocide. It was during his tenure at Płaszów that Göth encountered Oskar Schindler, a German industrialist who operated an enamelware factory in Kraków. Schindler relied on Jewish labor from the camp and dealt directly with Göth to obtain workers. The two men represented opposite poles of moral choice within the same system. Göth saw the prisoners as expendable instruments. Schindler gradually saw them as human lives worth saving. Through bribes and favors, Schindler persuaded Göth to let certain groups of workers remain at the factory rather than be deported. Later, when the camp began to be dismantled as Soviet forces advanced westward, Schindler negotiated permission to transfer his entire operation, along with about 200 Jewish workers, to a new site in Branek, in what is now the Czech Republic. Göth approved the plan, likely because it allowed him to move stolen goods under the cover of legitimate transport. That decision, however self-serving, indirectly saved the lives of those on what later became known as Schindler's List. By mid-1944, the atmosphere in Płaszów had grown even more desperate. The Red Army was approaching from the east, and German authorities ordered the systematic closure of camps in occupied Poland. Göth responded with intensified brutality. Thousands of prisoners were sent to Auschwitz or Mauthausen, while others were executed to erase evidence of mass murder. At the same time, rumors circulated among SS ranks that Göth was under investigation for theft and uncontrolled behavior. Those rumors proved true. An internal SS audit uncovered evidence of large-scale embezzlement and unauthorized killings. To Himmler's bureaucracy, Göth's corruption, not his cruelty, was the problem. Killing prisoners was expected. Keeping the proceeds was not. On the 13th of September 1944, Göth was relieved of his command and recalled to Berlin for disciplinary proceedings. Płaszów did not long outlast him. Under a new commandant, its remaining prisoners were deported or killed, and by early 1945 the site was dismantled as Soviet troops closed in on Kraków. When the Red Army reached the area in January 1945, they found little more than scorched ground and a few surviving inmates. Amon Göth's career as commandant had lasted barely 18 months, yet in that short period he had orchestrated and personally carried out thousands of murders. His name would become permanently linked with Płaszów, where survivors later testified that, when you saw Göth, you saw death. After his removal from command in September 1944, Amon Göth returned to Germany under investigation by the SS Court of Honor, the internal tribunal responsible for policing its own officers. The charges were not moral in nature. The SS had no interest in his brutality toward prisoners. Instead, Göth was accused of corruption, theft of state property, and economic misconduct, specifically of diverting valuables confiscated from Jewish inmates for his personal use. He was held briefly in Breslau and later in Berlin, awaiting trial. Yet as the Nazi state crumbled under military pressure, bureaucratic discipline dissolved. By the end of 1944, the SS leadership had far greater concerns than internal corruption. The proceedings against Göth stalled, and in early 1945 he was quietly released. For several months he wandered through southern Germany, attempting to recover the stolen goods and cash he had dispersed among various storage sites and intermediaries. He visited acquaintances in Austria and Czechoslovakia, among them Oskar Schindler, whose relocated factory at Branik housed many former Płaszów workers. Whether Göth sought to reclaim property or to seek refuge remains uncertain, but the attempt was short-lived. By the spring of 1945, Germany was collapsing. Allied armies advanced from both east and west, cities lay in ruins, and the regime Göth had served with such devotion was disintegrating. Suffering from chronic stomach illness and psychological instability, he was admitted to an SS medical facility in Bavaria. When the Third Reich capitulated in May 1945, Göth was still a patient there, effectively stranded in the remnants of a system that no longer existed. He tried to disguise himself as an ordinary German soldier, exchanging his SS uniform for that of a Wehrmacht enlisted man. The ruse was temporary. In May 1945, US troops occupied the area and detained all military personnel for screening. Göth was sent to the Dachau internment camp, which the Americans had converted into a holding center for captured Germans. His identity was revealed by chance. Among the displaced persons employed at the camp was Józef Zilberberg, a Polish Jew who had survived Płaszów. Recognizing Göth, Zilberberg informed the American authorities that the unassuming prisoner before them had once commanded the camp where thousands had perished. The discovery ended Göth's brief anonymity. He was extradited to Poland in early 1946 to stand trial before the Supreme National Tribunal in Kraków, the same city where his crimes had been committed. It was one of a series of post-war trials that paralleled the larger proceedings at Nuremberg, but focused on atrocities committed on Polish soil. Göth entered the courtroom on the 27th of August 1946. The physical transformation was striking. The once imposing SS officer appeared heavier, pale, and visibly aged. Years of heavy drinking, illness, and confinement had eroded the arrogance that had once defined him. Nevertheless, he remained defiant. Representing himself, he denied the charges and attempted to cross-examine witnesses personally. The evidence against him was overwhelming. The indictment listed his responsibility for the murder of more than 8,000 people during his command at Płaszów, and for numerous additional killings in connection with the Kraków and Tarnów ghetto liquidations. Over 70 witnesses testified, former prisoners, guards, and Polish civilians, each describing scenes of random executions, mass shootings, and systematic cruelty. Göth's defense rested on familiar arguments that he had acted under orders, that the shootings were responses to sabotage or escape attempts, and that his subordinates exaggerated their accounts. The tribunal was unmoved. His own former SS colleagues confirmed his corruption and his erratic behavior. On the 5th of September 1946, after only 10 days of proceedings, the court found Amon Göth guilty of war crimes and crimes against humanity. The sentence was death by hanging. 8 days later, on the morning of the 13th of September 1946, the sentence was carried out at the former site of the Płaszów camp. The place where he had once ruled with absolute power became the ground of his execution. Witnesses described a brief, silent ceremony. Afterward, his body was cremated, and his ashes were scattered into the Vistula River. Göth was 37 years old. He left behind his estranged wife, Annie Geiger, their 2 surviving children, and an illegitimate daughter, Monika Hertwig, born from his relationship with his mistress Ruth Irene Calder. Calder remained loyal to his memory, defending him publicly for decades before taking her own life in 1983. For history, Amon Göth stands as one of the many mid-level perpetrators whose obedience and zeal made the Holocaust possible. He was not a strategist or a policymaker. He was an implementer, a man who turned ideology into daily terror. His crimes were not acts of sudden madness but of routine, killings executed as administration. The story of his trial closed one chapter of reckoning, yet the moral questions lingered. How could an educated man from a cultured family become an architect of such cruelty? Was he driven by ideology, ambition, or simply by the intoxication of unchecked power? Historians have offered different answers, but survivors of Płaszów agreed on one point. Under Göth, life and death were arbitrary, decided at the pull of a trigger or the flick of a hand. In the years that followed, the world would come to know his name through witness testimony, archival records, and later through cultural portrayals such as Steven Spielberg's 1993 film Schindler's List, where his character, played by Ralph Fiennes, brought the reality of Płaszów to international audiences. The historical record, however, requires no dramatization. It shows a man who embodied the system he served, bureaucratic, violent, and corrupt to the core. From his privileged beginnings in Vienna to his final moments on the gallows in Kraków, Amon Göth's life traces the moral descent of an ordinary individual shaped by ideology into an agent of mass murder. In the archives of the Second World War, Amon Göth's name occupies a smaller space than those of Hitler, Himmler, or Göring. Yet his actions carried out on a single patch of occupied Polish soil reflect the entire structure of the Nazi enterprise. He was not a leader shaping policy, but an executor who transformed ideology into daily reality. The terror he unleashed at Płaszów showed how ordinary administration could become an instrument of mass murder when authority was absolute and conscience absent. Göth's life also illustrates how evil can appear not as chaos, but as efficiency. His meticulous reports, his respect for procedure, and his outward professionalism masked a void of empathy. In his hands, obedience became a justification for cruelty, and order a disguise for moral collapse. The crimes of Płaszów were not born of passion, but of habit, the routine exercise of power in a world that had stripped its victims of humanity. When the war ended, justice reached him quickly, but the questions his life raises remain. How does a society allow such men to rise? How do institutions teach individuals to see other people as expendable? And how fragile is morality when ideology promises purpose? Amon Göth's story does not end with his execution in 1946. It endures as a warning. Behind every system of oppression stand men who believe they are merely doing their job, and history remembers what they did when they were given permission to forget compassion.